In this tutorial, we'll take a look at concepts, terminology, and coherence checking in ChapterLab. ChapterLab lets you record the concepts and terminology that you're going to explain in your document, and it lets you set up relationships between them. The most important type of relationship is the prerequisite relationship, which is very much like high school or college courses. You can imagine it would be very difficult to take a calculus course if you didn't have the prerequisite course of algebra, and it would be very difficult to understand algebra if you didn't understand basic arithmetic. So in a book-length writing project, you often end up explaining concepts, and they have to be explained in a particular order because the later concepts build on the previous ones. The problem with very large writing projects is very frequently you end up rearranging your chapters to try to find the best, arrangement. And when you do that, you run the risk of having some of these definitions or explanations of concepts or terminology sort of in the wrong order. Traditional word processors don't offer any support for sort of detecting these kinds of problems, but ChapterLab does, and I'll show you how it works. So let's continue our math analogy. We'll pretend that we're writing a giant book about all kinds of math, and we'll start with the basic concepts. So to create a new concept, you go to the Concepts and Terminology folder and say New Concept, and I'll say let's explain arithmetic first. So then I can write a definition of what arithmetic is here, maybe some examples, and then maybe I'll create some more concepts. So algebra. So I can start setting up relationships to the other concepts here. If I say add, I'll say algebra has a conceptual prerequisite of arithmetic. You have to understand arithmetic before you can understand algebra. So I'll say okay, and maybe I'll do one more. As we said before, calculus, and calculus depends on algebra. Now I'm just going to open up the concept dependencies panel, and here it has drawn a little diagram saying that we need to discuss arithmetic first, and then algebra depends on arithmetic, that's that arrow there, and then calculus depends on algebra. To make this diagram a little more interesting, maybe I'll add one more. I'll talk about combinatorics, which doesn't require calculus, but I guess it does require algebra, let's say. Okay, and now our diagram is a little bit more interesting looking. So what's the point of doing this? Well, first of all, it sort of helps us arrange our thoughts. For very simple cases like this, I mean, you can sort of figure it out yourself. You don't need to write it down, but this tool can help you think about more complex cases. But the real reason to do this is to take advantage of something that we call coherence checking. So I'm going to start writing my manuscript. I'm going to start creating some text blocks. Maybe my book will have an introduction chapter, but then I'll have a chapter on arithmetic, and then maybe I'll have another chapter on algebra, and then let's mix it up. We'll talk about applications, and then maybe we'll get into calculus here. So if I start fleshing out some of these chapters, maybe I'll go to arithmetic and enter this definition. Maybe I'll highlight the word as the first definition of a term. Here we're defining this term. Now ChapterLab is not yet smart enough to know that we're talking about a concept that we've defined. Maybe in the future it will be smart enough to recognize those words, but it's not there yet. So for now, what we have to do is insert a tag saying, here's where we're defining a concept. We're going to insert a concept definition marker. And here's our concept that we're defining. And so it sticks a little tag in here. And now if you export your document, this tag is not going to show up, but it is present here for our purposes. You may have also noticed that in the concept dependencies view, arithmetic has become green. That says we've now defined it. So now if we say that we're going to define algebra is, I'll just say ... Now if we define algebra here, now algebra is also green. In fact, it's bright green because it is depending on a previous concept. Now let's say I'm going through my manuscript and I decide that, well, maybe it would be nice just to mention arithmetic in a appendix, so maybe I'll move it to the end. This causes a small problem because now chapter 2 is mentioning algebra, but to understand algebra you need to understand arithmetic, and now arithmetic is in chapter 5. So algebra has turned red. But we can correct that by moving algebra after arithmetic. Again, this is a very simple case, and it may be sort of obvious, but for a very large document with many concepts, this might be useful. I'm just going to move this back, and we'll talk about one more case. So we've seen definitions of concepts, but often you, after a definition, you end up referring to them, and you can mark that as well with a concept reference marker. So here I'm mentioning arithmetic. I'm not defining arithmetic, but I'm referencing or mentioning it. Unfortunately, in the current version of ChapterLab, if you move a reference before the definition, it's still not indicated in the diagram that is a problem. But we do have a separate tool that can point out those kinds of problems. So if you locate the text cursor somewhere in your manuscript and then you right-click and say refresh concept reference view for current cursor location, then it brings up this view. So it says where our cursor currently is. Arithmetic, yes, has been defined by this point, and there are a total of 1 mentions of it so far. Algebra has also been defined, but calculus and combinatorics have not. So in this case, we're in good shape because we're mentioning arithmetic here, and yes, it has been defined. However, if I move applications to Chapter 2, and now I'm going to refresh this view, well, now we can find that we have a problem because we're referencing this concept, but no, arithmetic has not been defined by this point. However, it would be nice to have this kind of problem shown in this dependencies view, and we're working on that. It should be ready in the next release.